For those that don't know me, I'm Luigi. I'm part of the board. I'm part of the communications division for the WCA. Been with the WCA for about 10 years now. It's I must say it's a great way to meet people like-minded. Lots of people that have a lot of information on various backgrounds like river tripping, canoe tripping, winter camping, cross-country skiing, and all the likes. So I mean, if you're new to the club, welcome. You definitely will find someone that will share your passion or whatever your outdoor adventure may be. So don't be shy to ask for support or questions. And whenever we do start getting the trips back up and running, great way to meet people like-minded, like I said. So sit back, relax, enjoy. And I mean, I will be sticking around afterwards the presentation if some of you people have some questions. There's always something to be learned from all these presentations that we do at the educational workshop. So again, feel free to stick around, and I'll be always at the bottom, at the beginning, at the end of every presentation I do. So if you do have a question, like, oh, I forgot to ask that, always feel free to shoot me an email. I'll be glad to help you out. So a little bit of who we are for those that are new members. We also own the MyCCR, My Canadian Canoe Routes. Great way to find out about some sort of either river or a lake or a route that you're not sure about. All over North America, people put in their 2 cents. It gets updated on a regular basis. Great information. A large community of outdoor enthusiasts from the USA and Canada. We do own the CCR, WCA that is. So it's always being updated. Again, like I said, it's a great way to meet people. And we have a philosophy of paying it forward, just like the previous generation did with us. Now it's our turn to share that information with the next generation and carry on that tradition. So like I said, sit back, relax. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions. To learn from my mistakes. I was one of those traditional campers that brought everything on a canoe trip and or hiking trip and definitely paid for it. So you'll see the mistakes that I've made for sure. So here's one action shot here. I hiked the Gross Morin Trail, the long range traverse, and you'll see soon that all the mistakes I made on that particular trip. So before I get started, just want to mention that all the information I'm going to be talking about in this particular presentation, we're always talking about the extremes. That is, your traditional camper, bring all the gear, and also the ultra lightweight. Now, you can also do a mix of both. There's no sort of proper way of doing things. You can mix and match things however you see things. And I'll talk about that of where I tend to bring some extra additional items that I think that's relevant for me and my comfort zone. So this is just to spark interest, generate some ideas. Again, you don't have to duplicate what I've done. So it's a good starting point. Okay, let's put it that way. So basically, what is ultralight camping? So it emphasizes on carrying the lightest and simplest gear. Every single piece of gear has a purpose. So for example, the example I like to give is my buddy that we go canoe tripping with every year on our typical 2-week trip. He loves to bring his Rambo knife, and we're talking about maybe 16-inch blade. Never uses it, but he must bring the Rambo knife. Never uses it though. So again, things like that. The overall weight really depends on the type of trip you're doing. For example, if you're going hiking, you're going to be going a lot lighter than, let's say, going canoe tripping or river tripping. And also how many people come with you. As the saying goes, many hands make light work. So if you have a lot of gear, you can easily break that gear down by divvying up that gear. And again, gear is used for multiple purposes. For example, if you're hiking, their hiking poles will be used to erect a tarp, for example. Okay, so everything is accounted for and used for accordingly. So again, as I mentioned before, I hiked the long range traverse in Newfoundland. That pack that I have, you see in this picture, is 125 liters. And I'm not a very big person. And that every step I took was absolute agony. And I learned a lot from that trip. The beauty about ultralight camping is that it's relevant to any age or skill level. You don't have to spend a ton of money right away. As long as you're mindful of what you bring, that's basically the first step. And can be very simple and inexpensive to implement, as we'll talk about momentarily. There you see another shot of ankle busters right there with that massive anchor pack on, right? Again, traditional packer like my buddy, compared to ultralight packer. So where do you start? So the first step really is to look at your existing gear of what you have. So what I like to tell people is pack like you typically do, make your piles. But then what you do is there any piece of gear that you do not need to bring with you? Okay, this is the first critical step of shedding weight. If there's something that you're always bringing with you that you never use, that's additional weight that you're lugging with you around, right? So maybe it might be time to leave that behind. Now, the beauty about knowing a lot of people is that can you possibly borrow gear from them that's possibly lighter, right? So you don't have to go and spend a ton of money right away. If you know a big group of people, hey, can I borrow your solo tent, for example? Then you get an idea of actually what you like and what you don't like, or what you wouldn't buy. So for some gear that you try out. And then of course you can always go to the next step is renting lighter gear. So renting an ultralight tent, a warmer sleeping bag, possibly renting a lighter canoe for those doing a lot of portaging and doing a lake travel. The next critical step is start documenting what you bring. Just like my buddy with his Rambo knife, if you've never used it in the last 3 trips, maybe it's time to leave it behind, right? So by documenting what you bring, you know exactly what you brought. I didn't use this, this, and this. Maybe I'll leave them behind, okay? Now, the question I get quite a bit is, I'm new to ultralight camping. Is purchasing lighter equipment going to be expensive? It depends on what your objective is. If your goal is to shed every gram and reduce the weight as possible, yes, it can be expensive, especially if you're starting off ultralight camping or camping in general. But as long as you're mindful with gear and you break gear down of what you need and don't need, yeah, you can. It doesn't have to be horribly expensive. It's basically being really mindful of what you're bringing, and we'll give you some examples later on. So all the gear or all the weight basically will be in your sleeping system or your tent, your sleeping bag, and your cooking system and food. Now, some accessories, depending on what you're bringing, can add up to something like a major piece of equipment like a tent, but typically all the weight is inside these 3 sort of areas. Again, when we talk about gear selection, we're always talking about the extremes. That of a traditional camper, ultra lightweight, or sometimes you can also do a mix of both. Remember, you don't have to do exactly like the ultralight, just whatever suits you and your needs. So typically when I started doing ultralight camping or when I started my solo trip, I used to bring a 2-person tent just because I like the additional room. The problem with that is you're carrying a lot of additional weight. So can you get a solo tent, or can you rent or borrow a solo tent? Now that'll depend on how of your physical stature. If you're a very large person, very tall, you may not actually fit in a solo tent because they're not made for that. So sometimes you might have to actually use a 2-person tent. Can you reduce your physical pack size? I find that a lot of my friends, they bring their 90-liter packs, and then they're like, well, I got plenty of room. I can keep stuffing that pack until it's full. That's a problem, right? Because now you're almost encouraging yourself to bring more gear. So can you physically reduce the pack you bring from, let's say, a 90 to a 65? Or can you physically reduce the amount of barrels you take on a canoe and or river trip? A lot of people I know, they like to bring their mountaineering hiking boots, believe it or not. Again, mountaineering compared to regular hiking boots, and then trail running, right? A lot of variation in between. Depending on what you're doing, I find that typically hiking boots work best. I mean, trail running shoes are great. Again, you're more likely to go over a rock or something like that and sprain an ankle. But again, it depends on what your objective is. Also, I noticed that a lot of my friends, they bring a ton of fuel for their stove. Can you physically reduce the amount of fuel that you bring with you? Or in extreme cases, can you actually eliminate the stove altogether? I have a friend of mine that does a lot of ultralight camping. He only brings dehydrated jerky with him. Doesn't have any coffee, doesn't have any tea. That's all he has. Now that may be extreme, but yes, it does eliminate a lot of the additional weight. Do you normally carry all the water with you when traveling? Now, when I first started camping, I couldn't stand the taste of filtered water or those tablets. And what I used to do is I used to try to pump all the water with me for my first few days. And that is actually a no-no because water is extremely heavy. So pump water as needed. And let's actually revisit how much 1 liter of water weighs. So you see here, I actually measured out 1 water exactly. I measured the actual container itself. The container weighs 170 grams. Altogether, with a liter of water, it weighs about 1.15. You minus the actual weight, the net weight of the container itself, and that liter of water weighs 980 grams. Now, for those people that love to bring their wine or booze in the Tetra Paks, that's a lot of additional weight that you're hauling. And I know friends of mine that insist they must have their wine for dinner, and they're hauling 4 liters or 4 Tetra Paks. So you can see how things add up very, very quickly. Again, here we talk about the extremes. Do you typically bring a proper water bottle, typically an Nalgene bottle or a hard plastic bottle? Or can you actually just bring a disposable water bottle and refill that up? Of course, there's pros and cons for both. But again, it all depends on how extreme you really want to be in sharing those grams. Remember, grams make up kilograms. We talked about that solo tent before. Can you physically go to a smaller tent, a solo tent? Or depending on your physical stature, or if you're bringing a dog with you, for example, you may need a 2-person tent. Or can you actually eliminate the tent altogether? Here I have a picture of, I went camping with my buddy of mine. Both were going solo, we were just traveling together. I'm in the background in the blue tent, and he just actually erected a tarp with his sleeping system underneath. Now, of course, the bugs will chew you like crazy depending where you're going, but again, that's a whole other conversation. But can you physically reduce your weight by eliminating your tent? Absolutely. Again, we mentioned the actual packs themselves. Can you physically reduce the pack itself, or limit yourself only to 1 canoe pack as opposed to several packs or several barrels? Okay. Again, I find that when the bigger pack that I bring, I tend to want to put more gear in there just because I physically have the space for it. Cooking gear, especially if you're going solo, instead of bringing multiple pots, can you reduce your pots to only a single pot? Or can you reduce the amount of multiple pots you bring with you if you're going with a group? All depends on if the people that you go in your group are also foodies. If they're foodies, they like to eat, you're probably going to have a lot of variety of different pots and pans because they're going to cook some gourmet meals. That's what I find with my buddies. Air mattresses, I'm always torn with air mattresses. I find that the air mattress themselves, if you're on a slight slope, you always go sliding around. It's a lot more comfortable sleep. But then if you go with the foam pad, you stay in place, but it's a lot more firm. So I'm always torn between back and forth of which one to pick. Air mattresses have come a long way. They've gotten a lot smaller, a lot more insulated, a lot more easier to fill with air, depending on the valve you have. Now, some are rated for different seasons. There's a 3-season and actually a 4-season. So depending on if you're going winter camping, you can get a 4-season. Mind you, the 4-season a lot more heavier and also a lot more expensive. I think they're about $300 now. They've gotten quite expensive over the years. But depending on your select, you can also do a 3/4 size air mattress, believe it or not, which is quite good. Sheds some weight. One thing I did right off the bat is when I started ultralight camping is that I got rid of my general purpose -7 sleeping bag. That's what I used to haul with me every 3 seasons. I found that it was quite warm and it was a little bit heavy. So by going to a warm weather sleeping bag, not only does it reduce your weight, but also you make it a lot more comfortable sleeping at night. Again, here we talk about the extremes. So when I do a canoe trip, I actually bring a small little chair with me. That's the only slush or the little treat I treat myself with. Now, you don't have to bring a small chair. You can actually just sit on a regular foam pad. I do find that the chair is a little bit better because I'm actually able to truly relax my lower back. But again, what we always talk about, the extremes, right? Or you can just sit on the ground for that matter if you really wanted to. Wood processing, I used to bring both when I was solo tripping, and now I'm basically ditching my axe just because it weighs so much. And you don't really need an axe if you're just sawing wood. You just put the piece of wood in the fire themselves. Let the fire take care of all the chopping for you. And a lot of accidents actually happen because of people chopping or splitting wood, believe it or not, with their lacerations. But I just tended to bring a small little saw, and I find that that's plenty for me. Safety equipment, one thing that I never scrimp on. No one ever plans to have an accident that particular outing. One thing I always bring, whether it's a Z-Drag kit or a heavy duty first aid kit. I mean, that's one thing you should never scrimp on to save weight. Here's an action shot. Once you start going light, it's actually quite pleasurable. So now we talk about intro to gear weighing. Once you start weighing gear itself, now you be quite mindful of how much things weigh. Remember, people, everything weighs something, regardless of how light it is. Everything has a weight to it. Now, you don't need an industrial scale like I do to be able to weigh gear. All you really need is a bench top scale, max about 5K weight capacity, and that will definitely serve you well. This is where you start to be mindful of how much things weigh. Remember, grams make up kilograms. Always try to get an idea of how much things weigh, and always remember needs versus your wants. Okay, that's the critical step of shedding weight. So the first thing we talk about is a lot of people are very familiar with those Nalgene containers. They may put some gear in it. They may put some food in that. They're great. Nalgene containers are awesome. They're very, very heavy duty. As you can see here, this one in particular, I think it's a larger size. It weighs 190 grams. Now, one thing I have a beef with the Nalgene containers is that if you're going canoe tripping and you're using a lot of barrels, there is no give with the Nalgene containers. It's very, very rigid plastic. It's great heavy duty, but there is no give. So what ends up happening is you can actually line the bottom of your barrel and you'll have all these gaps, right? In an ideal world, you want to fill that whole barrel without any gaps in an ideal world, but sometimes it's not possible. So what I've done over the years is instead of going from using a Nalgene container, I've actually switched over to a peanut butter container of equivalent size. So you can see here, I actually have one. The beauty about a peanut butter container is that it gives. So you can actually shove this on the side of a barrel, just enough slight give. And you can see here how much it weighs, only 60 grams compared to I believe the 190 that the Nalgene container has. Okay. So you can see just by using a container or multiple containers, you can save a lot of weight on just the containers itself. Another trick I use over the years is pickle containers, right? So let's say you're dehydrating or you're hydrating a meal. The beauty about the pickle containers is that they actually have a gasket along the perimeter. So what happens is you can put a fluid in there, start hydrating your food. Doesn't matter if it's upside down. It's not going to leak. And again, this one is a 2-liter container, only weighs 130 grams. And again, the beauty is that there's a little bit of give. So if you put it in a barrel, when you're canoe tripping, it'll have a little bit of give so you can put more gear around it. That's the beauty about the thinner plastics. I used to always bring a book just in case I got rained on or windbound. As you can see here, and this is a field version, believe it or not, still weighs 340 grams. So if you had never ever touched that book throughout your whole week-long trip or 2 weeks, however many days you go, now you're just lugging around all this dead weight with you. Okay. Those Thermarest foam pads, believe it or not, 430 grams. Right. So depending on, I have a few friends that like to bring both an air mattress and a foam pad for their either canoe trip or hiking trip. So you can see how much it weighs all of a sudden. You factor in now in an air mattress, now you're almost looking at basically a kilo in weight. So you can see how all things add up very, very quickly. So I have a friend of mine that insists he must bring a full tube of toothpaste when we go canoe tripping. The last trip we did, I think we went for 14 days. He insists, no, I must bring my full tube of toothpaste. It's almost impossible. You're gonna be going through that much toothpaste in a 2-week period, unless of course you're just mounting the toothpaste on your toothbrush. So you can see here, a full tube of toothpaste is 140 grams. The flip side is, how about using a travel toothpaste and fill it up quite well? Here you go. You reduce the physical size, and now you go from 140, I believe, to 30 grams, right? You're still bringing your toothpaste with you, but not all that toothpaste with you, right? Again, it's almost impossible to be going through that much toothpaste in the given time you're going tripping, unless you're going for months on end. One thing I mentioned before is I'm shedding the axe every time I go on a canoe trip. Not my saw though, just the axe. As you can see here, this is a mid-size axe. made for to be fit in a barrel, 690 grams. So you can see if you don't use it on a regular basis, you're lugging a lot of dead weight with you. So here are just some examples of things that you can just reduce gear-wise. Plenty of examples here, smaller toothpaste, water bottles, right? So let's say you don't want to bring an actual water filter with you. You can just bring the tablets, food containers, cutlery. Instead of bringing a fork and knife spoon, how about bring a spork, for example? Sleeping pads, sleeping systems, tarps, knives, multiple. Again, my buddy with his Rambo knife, you can leave that behind. And of course, the axe itself. Just some examples, many examples of things you can do to shed weight. And what the key is, again, is your needs versus your wants. So that way, if you're dragging through the small little creeks, you're not going to be having to haul all that gear with you, all that additional weight. It's not going to be talking about clothing itself, of how much clothing you really need, and some clothing you can leave behind. Of course, depending what season you're going and what the weather calls for. So can you physically reduce the amount of clothing that you bring with you? Okay, so try to avoid extra items unless you're in really remote or really extreme environments. I always like to monitor the weather before I leave on a trip and adjust accordingly. So now if I know they're calling for several days of rain, I'll adjust accordingly, as opposed to, let's say, if they're calling for beautiful weather. Typical example I like to use, instead of bringing an actual dedicated smaller pillow, how about just filling a stuff sack, just put your clothes in there, and now you just created a little pillow. One thing I notice with all my friends and people I know is they bring a ton of extra footwear. And I mean everything. I'm talking about pair of shoes for the portage, camping shoes, hiking boots. And I always tell my friend, this is not the runways of Milan. You're not going to show off your shoe collection, right? So can you physically reduce the amount of shoes? Now, I do bring a set of Crocs rubber shoes. That way, if I have to trudge through some sort of creek or get wet, that way they can dry out very quickly. So again, very lightweight, very bendable. You can almost squish them in half, shove them in your barrel or the bottom of your pack. So now we're gonna be getting into food. Now the thing with food is it's very personal. I mean, depending if you're a foodie or you're a big eater or you just like food in general, it's your comfort food. I mean, it's a lot of variable. Okay. Good example, like I said, when my buddy likes to bring everything with him. So I find that people carry too much food most of the time, especially with the snacks. I remember the first time I went canoe tripping with some buddies of mine, new friends, and we were going for a week, and we had over 20 chocolate bars. I mean, so again, it's only really so much you can eat, right? I find that the snacks really increase your overall weight, especially the fresh veggies and fruits and meats. All that water in the actual fresh veggies will definitely weigh you down. And also try to limit the amount of additional food or meals that you bring with you, unless of course you're in a very remote area or can be picked up with a float plane where, depending on the weather situation, you can be windbound and have to stick around for a few more days. So it really depends on what you're doing. The key is to create a meal plan and stick to that. Who's going to be bringing what meal, which day, and who's responsible for what. That way you can actually avoid a lot of duplicates, such as like candies, a lot of the additional snacks and things like that. Again, all that weighs a lot of weight, or makes an additional weight. So start documenting what you bring, who's responsible for what. Now there's different ways of doing this. You can make a Google Doc, you can email a list out to people, have a physical copy where, let's say you get together as a group over a coffee, talk about who's gonna bring what, share that piece of paper. Whichever system works for you. The key is start documenting who's gonna bring what and who's responsible for what. That way you eliminate duplicates. So one thing I also try to do is I try to eliminate any sort of additional packaging that I have to bring with me on a trip. So for example, let's say you're buying a dehydrated meal or whatever, and it comes in multiple packaging, try to eliminate that packaging at home and just bring the bare essentials. Try to use multiple food containers for whatever it may be. So again, I talk about the peanut butter container. So once that peanut butter container is empty, let's say you put rice in here. Once you're done with it, now you can make this as, let's say, a small little garbage container, fit that in there, right? So it's a multiple use. Again, always try to reduce the packaging as much as you can whenever you buy food itself. So now we're gonna be getting into actually the art of dehydrating. Now, dehydrating is not a new thing. It's been around for a long, long time. Some cultures have been doing it for as early as 12,000 BC. So you can dehydrate most foods except for fatty foods, just because you can't get rid of the water content. It starts going rancid, and then it starts to spoil. It is cheaper and healthier than buying store-bought dehydrated food, especially for those people that are on very strict diets. I got a friend of mine that I go canoe tripping with. He can't have any salt whatsoever. Now, if you were to buy a dehydrated meal, it's loaded with salt. So the beauty about making your own meal, if you dehydrate it, you can actually make it to your own custom taste, okay? A dehydrator and a scale go hand in hand, and we'll talk about that momentarily. And typically when you start learning how to dehydrate, it takes a few trials to kind of get an idea of how to get it down pat and to perfect it to your liking and or to your friend's liking. So with dehydrating, basically what you're doing is you're always trying to eliminate the amount of water in that particular food, depending on what you're dehydrating. The amount of humidity in the room will determine how quickly the food will dehydrate. So for example, today it's very, very humid. You start dehydrating a meal, it can take almost several hours additionally of dehydrating that meal just because it's very, very humid. So what I like to do is crank the AC, give it a few hours, get rid of all that additional humidity, and then I start dehydrating my meal. I find that it saves a lot of time. And of course, the size and thickness of the cut pieces. So let's say, for example, you want to dehydrate zucchini. Again, as I mentioned before, fatty foods will not dehydrate well because the water does not evaporate and then it goes rancid. Okay. So here's me giving an example of dehydrating jerky. Typically, when I buy jerky to make, or buy meat to make jerky, I buy maybe about 1.5 kilos worth of meat. Now that may cost me about close to $40. You're thinking, whoa, $40, that's a lot of money to spend. But if we take a look at some examples of store-bought jerky, you'll see that's actually not a bad deal. Another picture of dehydrated jerky. So if we look at your typical name brand jerky, here we're talking about 80 grams for almost $7. Okay, so that is a lot. That is quite expensive. Here's another one, 63 grams for almost $7. So you can see by doing a little bit of elbow grease and a little bit of work on your end, you can actually save a lot of money by dehydrating your own meals. And you truly can dehydrate everything. For example, I make tomato sauce. Yes, I put into the dehydrator. A few hours later, it comes out almost as bouillon or as flakes. You eliminate all that water content. Another meal I like to make when I go canoe tripping is I like to dehydrate dal. So basically what happens is it comes out several hours later, almost looks like potato chips, believe it or not. Again, you eliminate all that water. And I'm always dehydrating on parchment paper. I find that it reduces the amount of mess and it captures all that dampness and all that fluid in its actual tray itself. Now, unless you're dehydrating soups, you can actually put it in some of the toaster oven trays. They actually work best, or smaller oven trays. They work quite good. So I find over the years, the best way to actually dehydrate a meal is you cook whatever meal you want, you weigh it on the scale, you weigh it with the container or bag that you're gonna be storing it in. You're allowed to dehydrate overnight. When you re-weigh that meal, you always re-weigh in the same bag container that you initially weighed it in. And the difference between when you cook it and you dehydrate it, that is the amount of water that has to be added when I can't. Now, for the engineers out there, you may be saying, well, that's not the same measurement, millimeters compared to grams. And you're right, it's not. But I find that I've never had someone complain saying, hey, this meal is off by 5 mils or 5 grams. So the key is to always be patient while adding water while it's rehydrating. That way you don't add too much water and throw the taste off, okay? The key is to be patient. So sometimes what I like to do is if I know that I'm gonna be rehydrating a large meal, specifically when you talk about beans and or chickpeas, to actually put it in a pickle container with less water than it calls for. And by the time several hours later, we get to camp, I double check it. And if I have to add more water, I will. Remember, it's always easier to add water than it's to subtract that water. So the cons of ultralight camping is that if a single piece of equipment fails, it can ruin a trip. For example, if you forget or something goes wrong with your water filter, you have no means of filtering water. If you focus too much on shedding weight, it can put you in a dangerous situation, like forgetting or not bringing the first aid kit, or let's say forgetting that toque when it gets really, really cold and the temperature drops. And of course, it can be extremely expensive to upgrade to ultralight equipment like titanium pods and ultralight solo tents. So it can be quite expensive over the years. Now, if you're mindful and you have your gear, and anytime you have to replace the gear, perfect opportunity to actually upgrade to, let's say, ultralight gear, as opposed to going out and buying gear when you already have gear. Any questions at all about what we've covered? That's basically my presentation for you people. Any questions at all of what we've covered?
I have a question.
Okay, we'll go back to not share mode, and then we can see everybody.
Yep. Okay.
So discounting the food that you bring, what is your typical my
bag weight or my overall weight?
Yeah, when it's packed.
If I'm going on a solo trip, so the last solo trip I went on was a few weeks ago, I was at 13 kilos.
20,
which is about
29 pounds.
Something like that, just under 30 pounds.
Nice. And that doesn't include the food. Right?
That includes the food.
That includes the food. Wow.
That includes the food. Yeah. Again, I'm not one where I must have my coffee every morning or I must have my tea. I mean, that may be extreme to some people, but I can get it under 30 pounds. And I went for, I think it was for 10 days.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, it's really the key is to be mindful of what you're bringing, right? So I'm not bringing an axe, I'm not bringing any books, nothing like that.
My books are all in my phone, so.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. But yeah, you can do it. I mean, it depends on what your objective is, really.
And maybe talk about group stuff. Like sometimes you go on, trips with many, 2, 3, 4 canoes, and you hint about, if everybody brought their own pot set, you'd end up with, 8 pot sets, versus you do a Google Doc or a, spreadsheet or something, and you just, okay, we're going to bring, I don't know, a 7 liter and a 5 liter and a 4 liter, and we're going to stack them all together, and we're going to, and that's the pots, So you could you save weight as a group by not, bringing more than you need. The only little issue there sometimes is if you're on a aggressive river, you really want to divide your pots so that if you lose a barrel, you don't lose everything. But generally, Ontario and stuff, it's all pool and drop. It's going to end up in a lake somewhere. It's not going to keep going for 20, 30K, So generally we don't have that issue, but, just think about group things where you have to coordinate and not overbring stuff.
The key really is communication. I find that a lot of people think, well, when they're going through their own personal gear and people have to decide, okay, who's going to bring what? People may be like, well, I'm just going to bring this just in case because I think it would be great to have. And they don't communicate that with the group of who's going to, why they're bringing that, right? So depending on what it is, and I find that a lot of, even with people I've been going for years, a lot of people will still bring their additional gear or duplicates. And again, I mean, it's overkill, right? I mean, like Gary said, it's a good idea to have different gear and different barrels. That way, if you do spill, you're not maybe missing all those pots or the stove, for example. But it's key to actually talk about who's going to bring what and make sure there's no duplicates, because again, you're just hauling weights with you that you don't have to.
Yeah, and sometimes it could be a little dangerous, like especially when you're doing like lakes and lots of portaging. Usually at the beginning of a trip when you're heavy, mistakes at the end of the day, and that's where you pay the price because you're just totally bagged, right? And every time you pick up all the gear and go, it takes energy to do that. So when you get to the end of the day, especially, you really have to question doing long portages today because people are going to trip at the end of the day and cause issues. And the weight is a big factor that, it's going to hurt people. Then you might even get forced into doing double and triple portaging because you have so much weight. You just can't do it in a trip.
I mean, especially if you're doing portage in separate goals. Remember, anytime you have to go back and forth, always time that length of portage by 3. You have to go to one end, come back, grab, let's say, the boat if you're just bringing the canoe pack, and then have to go again. So if you're hauling a lot of weight with you and your pack is easily 50 pounds, or let's say 23 kilos or whatever, that will wear you out very, very quickly. So if you're planning on traveling X amount of kilometers or doing X amount of distance and now you're really heavy, it may not be possible, just because now you're constantly lifting up that heavy pack, and it will wear you out, especially those portages will definitely wear you out.
And everybody's getting older, so it happens faster and faster.
It sure does. Sure does.
I think one more thing that I would contribute here is on longer trips, especially with larger groups, you end up starting with a lot of food.
Yeah.
And when it's a group effort to put the food together, it's easy for an individual to say, "Oh, it's okay if my meal is a little heavier." But if everyone thinks like that, you end up with a lot of extra weight. So it's what we've done before is we've set a maximum limit of weight per meal. So when people were planning their meals, they knew that they had to be under that weight for each meal they had.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, people are always worried about weight, about food.
We usually
always.
set it, like if we're going for a 3-week trip, everybody brings 30 liters. So it's a half a barrel, and we're gonna have 3 barrels of food for 6 people, say. And if you go over, well, we don't want you to go over. That's the forcing function. But then we actually start critiquing people's food, saying, "What are all these things? What are all these things?" And some meals are slightly heavier, of course, because if you go with oatmeal, it's going to be pretty light. If you go with, I don't know, bacon and eggs or whatever, or steaks, it's going to get heavier. So you've got to critique people. And when you start going with a group of people, you start getting the norm. Okay, this is acceptable. This is over the top, or this is too little of food. That's the other thing is people, when they make group meals, tend to make more than they need. And that's a problem, because now you're going to pitch it, or do you bag it and eat it the next day at lunch, something like that. So I hate to make food and throw it away or burn it. So normally I bring one of those Nalgene containers like Luigi mentioned, a half-liter thing. And I just, whatever, if there's excess at supper, I put it in there and I eat it for lunch. It's enough for a lunch or two for, you could share with somebody instead of throwing it away, because it's all good food, Or if people are really hungry and there's nothing left, there's nothing left. That's it,
Yeah, but this is why I mentioned to communicate with people with either using a Google form, so start documenting who's going to bring what. That way there are no surprises. I mean, everything is accounted for. And when people first start either river tripping or canoe tripping or hiking, they're always worried about not enough food, right? And this is why you'll always have more food than you really need, just because people are panicking that just in case. And that just in case can be several kilos of extra food that you may not even touch, that you may have to throw in the garbage, unfortunately. So again, it's all about that communication that's critical. Who's going to bring what and how much and why. So again, always have that conversation and always share that Google Doc, hard copy, email, whatever it may be, but just share that and pass on that message.
Yeah, there are little tricks you can do too. Like for me, I always bring 125 grams of spaghetti, whatever, noodles per person. If you're a huge eater, you can go 150. If you're a light eater, you can go 100. So I'm thinking 125 is a good number. Normally when you buy spaghetti, you get 900 grams. That's 150 times 6. So 6 people, 7 people there. So generally that meal, I throw that whole pack in. I could feed 6 people and I have a little left over for the next lunch, which I eat. The other trick you can do, you can go a little under. And if say you're skimped on the meal, you can just invent a Canoe soup or something that has flavor and liquid that will, have an extra cup of something for somebody if they, they're chomping at the bit, or some kind of dessert you can invent where you can hand it out or not hand it out, you know? Like a baking product maybe or something.
One question I see here is, well, when I dehydrate all my food, what I put in. It really depends on what I'm dehydrating. If I'm dehydrating jerky and it's quite dry, I'll put in, let's say, in a Ziploc bag. Or if it's something that's a little bit more oily, let's say if I'm making tomato sauce, I will use a smaller version of the pickle container. That way, if it does leak a little bit of oil, it's not going to make a mess in my bag. And I've seen people just putting regular food in, let's say, a peanut butter container. Remember, people, these are not meant for fluids, and it leaks out and makes a mess in their bag. So depending on what you're dehydrating, either typically default setting is a Ziploc bag, or I go to a pickle jar container that has the gasket around, and I find that that's really the best thing. I try to reduce my garbage, and I know the plastic bags do make quite a bit of garbage. That's why I try to use the reusable containers as much as I can. But sometimes you're forced to use a plastic bag, unfortunately. But yeah, it's either a plastic bag or a plastic container.
Yeah. One of the advantages of plastic is it molds to any contour in your barrel, right? So you don't have space. You can wash the plastic and reuse it in the future. I have a friend, Linda. She does a lot of plastic washing. Or you could just keep capturing all the bags, and they're all flat, so they'll just lay on the bottom of your barrel. It's not an issue. And normally when you dehydrate it, everything is like dry. There's no, you know, like when we do hamburger meat, we dehydrate or cook the hamburger meat, kind of strain it through hot water to get rid of the oils, because the oils is what's the issue with the rancidness. To get rid of the oils in your dry hamburger meat, it lasts quite a few weeks. And it really tastes good in spaghetti sauce because it's like real hamburger. Generally, it's fine for 3-4 week trip. No problem. And everything's in plastic bag. Yeah, you got a lot of plastic, but it's all flat stuff, you know, if you want to pack it all out. So, and it's definitely, oh, we got a question from Gord, I think it is.
Yes.
Yes, go ahead, Gord.
When you're on a trip, maybe with 6 people, if the 6 bowls are put out at dinner time, and if you're cooking a 1-pot meal, the cook fills the 6 bowls, and that's it. You don't have any waste. Everybody is obligated to finish his meal. And as you said, if it isn't enough for somebody, you can always make up something else or have another soup, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and the only flaw in that plan is generally women eat less than men. So we generally scoops, you know, if it's a scooping thing, we do that, or people self-scoop and make sure there's a round 2. And if you don't want any more, you don't go for round 2, or, you know, hate what it tastes like or whatever. Or if you love it, you're going for round 2 or 3, you know. But generally, when you get to the end, we're almost like nothing left, or it's enough for the next, you know, lunch for somebody.
I hate having leftovers. Hardly anybody wants to eat them the next day.
Well, I gotta say, when you make chili or spaghetti sauce, it really tastes good because it's impregnated in the rice or the noodles or whatever. And actually at night, it's pretty cold. So the actual container, when you open it up, it's cold when you take it out at lunch. And I enjoy it, actually. It's okay. I like it. So.
And this is where getting to know the people on your travels is important, because a lot of times I find with meals, your eyes are bigger than your stomach when you get to camp and you're very, very hungry. So if you get to know people's habits, if you have some light snacks, just in case of, say, for example, as appetizers, that way they're not going to say, oh, give me 3 cups of pasta because I'm really hungry, and they only end up eating the 1. You're not throwing that out there. It's like, okay, people, let's all have a spoon and try to finish this pasta. So I find that if you have a little bit of appies, it makes less headaches down the road with leftovers.
Yeah. There's one other trick with longer trips. You don't have to make, like, say you're assigned 3 meals, 3 suppers, 3 breakfasts, whatever. you don't have to make 3 different breakfasts. You can stick to, you know, whatever you're going to make. If you're I don't know, a chili, you do 3 meals, 3 times 6 people meals of chili, and you're going to have chili every 6 days. But that's your, you know, that's your meal. So what could happen then? You don't have to divide it equally to 3. You could put more in if you feel people will be hungrier that day, or a little less. You know, you can modulate. So you almost have like a staple, like, you know, you had flour and you're using it as required. The only negative is you want to make sure you don't over proportionate, you know.
Yeah.
It's pretty easy when you have a staple. It's 1/3 of first meal. The next meal is half, and then you got the last half, right? So
Yeah.
it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Any other questions, people?
Luigi, Tom here.
Yeah, Chris.
Hey, Tom.
Great presentation. Can you just talk about sort of items per canoe? And I'm talking about baggage like barrels, packs. And it's obviously a function of how many people and how long you're going. But
Right.
when you have, I mean, a solo trip for a few days, 6 people for a week, or 6 people for 3 weeks, what is your sort of aspiration that tells you you've really got it down and you're doing well for the number of items?
Well, I mean, it really depends on what your objective is for that particular trip. I mean, if you're going on an area where you want to cover X amount of distance, then of course being light is crucial and critical. So, and this is where I whenever I meet my friends for whatever trip we're planning is, what do we want to do or what's our objective? Now, if they just want to say, I just want to go out for 2 weeks, I just want to get away from all this concrete in the city, then that's a different trip. But it really depends on what you want to do. And when I do go with several boats, is the key is not to put, like as Gary said, not to put all the critical gear in one boat or in those 2 packs, because if you start to spill or something happens, even if you go on a lake traveling and doing portaging, if that boat flips and you don't tie it down to your boat, you're gonna lose that pack, right? So I try to put all the critical gear, such as the stove, the tent, what have you, in the same boat or in the same sort of, let's say either bag or barrel. I always try to divvy up all the important gears. So in the event that you're stranded, and if you have to force yourself, everyone to, let's say, one shelter or something, you can do that. So it's always a safety aspect of what if, right? So I find that if I do that, I've covered all my bases, right? So, but it really depends on, as a group, what you want to do. So, I mean, are you more laid back and want to relax, or do you want to go far and fast and do 20, 30K a day? It really depends. I mean, so it really depends on what you want to do. But like Gary said, don't put all your eggs in one basket. I find that I got caught like that once, where the canoe went over and the bag wasn't strapped down to the canoe, and we actually lost the pack. So it's amazing how things can change.
Yeah, I would say, go ahead, Gord.
My way of doing it is that we have 1 pack per person. That's all you need for most trips.
Yeah, it depends on where you're going and what you're doing. I mean, I find that a lot of my foodie friends will, I mean, it's a nonviolent protest, like 1 pack, that's it with food. I mean, no, I need more. And you always have this sort of debate, but it really depends on the people themselves, right? And their habits. This is why I always say it's very, very critical to communicate and say, hey, what you want to do, what's your objective? I mean, how do you feel comfortable doing X, Y, Z? And having that conversation before you go on your trip will save you a lot of aggravation and headaches down the road or down the portage.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Gore. Normally you have a personal pack. It's about 70 liters, and that's all your gear, your personal gear, your personal first aid, whatever. And then you have generally a group barrel. So that's a 60 liter with all the kitchen stuff, pots and dishes, and we tend to try to get, okay, let's just buy 6 dishes so they all nest properly. It's not like 6 different types of dishes. So you got, I don't know, 10 spoons, 10 forks, 10 bowls or whatever, 8 bowls, always a couple more, because what happens is you need something to serve stuff in, and you get stuff that's a group barrel, like a consistent nesting going on. Now, the danger with a group barrel is if the canoe gets pinned in the middle of the river and you can't get to it, you're kind of screwed. But generally in Ontario and where we go, Quebec, it's all pool and drop. You might get a pin in the middle of the river, but you're going to have to swim out and get to the canoe somehow. And then we have generally for a 3-week trip with 6 people, 3 barrels, 60-liter barrels. So we're each responsible to fill up 30 liters worth of food, or get your food down to 30 liter size.
Right.
And if it goes over that, you're in the bad books. With little overflow in the equipment barrel, because it's normally not packed to the gunnels. It's like maybe 40 liters out of 60. So there's a little bit of leeway there. But
I use the olive barrels, and the olive barrels will fit in a pack. So the olive barrels are spread throughout the packs, so everybody is carrying some food.
Yeah.
And
Right.
you don't have just one big heavy food bag.
Yeah.
Right.
I find the olive barrels are kind of limited. They're not huge, right? You're talking 20 liters or something, 15 liters.
That's right.
I know you could put about 4 in a big pack, but yeah, there's different philosophies, of course.
But one in each pack.
Yeah. I mean, if you go with the, let's imagine we have 6 people, 3 canoes. So we just talked about 3 food barrels. So you got your personal, so you got 2 personals and a food barrel, at least in a canoe. And then whoever's got the biggest canoe gets the equipment barrel also. So they'll have 2 barrels, food and equipment, and the personal gear. So, there's always somebody on a trip with a 17-foot boat. They're going to get the 4th barrel, probably. And then there's the typical 16.5-foot boats.
Yeah. So if you people has noticed so far is most of the questions we had were all based on food. And again, I find that most people bring way too much food most of the time, and they always bring extras. And this is how you can easily go overboard with weight with additional food and snacks. So again, it's always key that you have that conversation. Who's going to bring what? Who's going to start documenting who's going to bring what? As Gary said, if you want to limit to a certain barrel size, again, everyone's on the same page, right? So things can add up very, very quickly.
Yeah, I think the other thing, as you mentioned, Luigi, is coordination by Google Docs or spreadsheets or whatever. The issues where, okay, you're bringing a stove, I'm bringing a stove, but one guy's got gas and one guy's got white gas, and one guy's got propane. That doesn't work. You got to be all on the same page. Either everybody's bringing propane, so if the stove screws up, you're still using the guy's tank, or got 2 tanks. Or if you're bringing white gas, works in both stoves if one screws up. So that's your little bit of redundancy there. And then also about fuel. We've been on trips, major debates about fuel when you go way up in the Arctic. Are we going to have enough firewood, or is it all fuel all the way? And you can go crazy with fuel, or you can just make twig stoves and, try to get by with, twig stoves if you can. Or you have to go fuel all the way, Also, to cook, are you cooking to heat up water and boil noodles, or are you actually cooking the food? So when you go to Mech and you buy a, rehydrated thing, you can add water and 2 minutes later it's ready, or it's 20 minutes later. That's a lot of fuel. 20 minutes is 2 minutes, or, 5 minutes of heating the water. So looking at what you buy, if it's like reheating it or reconstituting it, or is it cooking it? That's a big difference in fuel.
Yeah, that's a good point, Gary. And sometimes over the years with different people going on different trips, there may be at times where you may need 2 stoves just because the group is so large, and trying to cook one meal, like Gary said, and now if you actually have to cook the meal as opposed to just say warming something up, and that one stove may be overworked, and sometimes you may need another smaller stove. And talking about what type of fuel you're going to use is critical. Again, it's all about that communication of who's going to bring what and how much you're going to bring, because that's the last thing you want is just try to figure this out on the portage or on the actual camp spot of what's going to happen for meals, especially when everyone's grumpy. Maybe you've been paddling all day in a light drizzle and cold temperatures. So, right. So again, it's all about having that conversation prior to leaving your trip.
Yeah, because we have a group that's been going out for decades, and we never take a stove. Like this whole notion about stoves and fuel is just foreign to our group.
Yeah.
We have mostly a saw, might have a little hatchet, and we'll get a day or 2 days of solid rain. We can still make a fire at night. We cook on the fire. The whole forest is full of fuel. And we find this conversation strange. Like we just shake our head and what are they talking about?
Yeah.
Stoves and fuel.
Yeah.
Because we rescued somebody on the Bonaventure River, and he was complaining that he had lost his stove. And I said, well, we never even have a stove. Don't worry, stay with us and that will be okay. Oh, he lost his fuel bottles. I said, well, if you've lost your stove, you don't need your fuel bottles. So then he just came with us and we cooked on the fire in the pots, and he sort of at the end, he stayed with us the last 2 days on the Bonaventure, and he said, yeah, he says, you know, I didn't have anything to worry about. You don't need a stove.
You make a good point, Fred, but you gotta keep in mind is that this is why we all don't wear the same shoes. And
Yeah, exactly.
For example, I mean, I don't drink coffee on a regular basis. I don't need coffee every day, but I have friends that if they don't have their coffee, they go ballistic. So again, it's all about sort of creature comforts and habits, right? And this is why we all do things very differently. And this is why some people need a stove. When I go tripping, I only bring dehydrated jerky. I don't need a stove. But again, I don't like to force my sort of habits on my friends or canoe partners because they are different individuals. And if the majority vote that they want a stove or they want that cooked meal, so be it. I'm not gonna be the squeaky wheel.
Well,
so it depends.
just-
It really depends on the group itself. And if you're going to the same groups of guys or gals or people, then of course you can have that no stove. But it really depends on the group, right?
Yeah, but we have a big coffee every morning. The first thing is put on in the morning is a big coffee. You'd be very happy with the coffee off the wood stove. It's a big coffee percolator, like a 15, 20 cup coffee maker.
Yeah.
Like it's a high priority on a wood stove.
Yeah.
You don't need to take a stove to have coffee.
Yeah.
No.
Well, the other
Okay.
thing is we always debate, like I always like cob water coffee because you throw it in the pot and you boil the crap out of it. And
And we take the pot and we swing it like
it
this.
doesn't matter when you're boiling it. It's
Pour it out.
30 minutes in boil. It's fantastic.
Yeah,
But,
that's
you know,
our coffee.
there's a philosophy. Oh no, we're gonna pour it through a filter and we're gonna do this. You don't need all that stuff, but you know. Let me throw another one at you. The pot issue we have. You know, we travel with a lot of people. We have some people, they don't like black pots. So on a fire, you get black pots. Everything's black.
Right.
There are people that their pots never saw a fire. They saw stoves. So they're like stainless steel, aluminum pots that are clean, relatively clean. So there's that issue that we get some pushback sometimes. We have to say up front, it's going to be a fire trip. And, you know, if it's pissing rain, okay, we'll go under the tarp and get the stove going. But even that, and Fred, we've tripped together. We've made fires on tarps, right? So
Yes.
as long as you wrap your brain around this tarp's not going to last forever, and it's going to have a few holes in a few years. You just make a fire under the tarp when you put the tarp high enough.
Yeah, we always have a fire under the tarp.
Yeah. So and that tarp in a few years is going to have a few holes, and you
Very few. But it's been a long
have to get
time.
another tarp.
And you just make a very good point is that by having that conversation before you go on trip and never assuming that people are willing to do X, Y, Z will save you a lot of aggravation and a lot of debating down the road. I mean, trying to figure out where someone doesn't want to get their pot black and be like, I mean, that could be almost a mutiny. So
Right.
or almost a nonviolent protest. So again, again, it's
Yeah,
always about
generally
that
that person,
communication.
if we go the fire route, they wouldn't bring their pots. We would have other
Right.
people's pots. Now, one of the
Right.
things we've done, because they all nest, we just use landscaping fabric. It's very thin, very light, and you just wrap it, put the next pot in, wrap it, put the
Right.
next pot in, wrap it, put the next pot in. And it's black already, so it looks okay. You know?
Blends in.
And all these things are very light, you know, landscaping fabric is like a water permeable, but it's pretty tough material, right? And it works fine for putting pots together. And then you end up, when you do that, the pot that's inside of a pot doesn't transfer all that carbon to the inside of the pot. So it kind of works well.
Yeah, there was a question about the tarp. We use a chlorophyll tarp. It's a, I think it's 5 meters by 5 meters.
Yeah, that's a big tarp. I love your tarp, Fred. It's big.
It's a massive tarp.
I love the fact that when I go with you, you carry it for me.
Sometimes. Yeah, I mean, there's all kind of tarps. You can buy, you know, one of those scout tarps. So generally what we do is it's a, I don't know, $100 tarp. And we get 2 10 by 12. We put a ridge line and we kind of overlap it. So we got like a 10 or about 12 by 20 when you put your tarps together on one ridge line. So each tarp is overlapped maybe a foot on the ridge line, and you get a pretty big tarp. For like 10 by 12 tarp is only maybe 1.5 liters size when it's all rolled up. It's not big, it's not heavy, it's maybe 1.5 pounds times 2. So that's what we do. I know Fred, the chloroform is fantastic. It's a center pole, looks like a big top tent, fantastic. You put this pole up the middle and you got 4 guidelines, and it's bulletproof, and it's got a pyramidal shape to it, right, Fred?
Yes.
I mean, it's bulletproof, and if you put the barrels on the edge where the wind is, you're like a little house in there. But it is a heavy solution.
Yeah.
You see a lot
It's for
of trips where you're not portaging.
Yeah, I'd say it's for river trips rather than backcountry trips.
Yeah.
See, if you're on, I learned about this with expedition trips on the Nahanni or the mountain, whatever. And that's the only tarp they're all using, because they're really not doing any portages.
Right.
And they need something that's big and something they can make fire under.
Yeah.
And I've got a little guide tarp if I'm backcountry that I can use. But if you've got a big group, then it's worthwhile. Or if you're in the tundra and you can't find trees and whatever to put a tarp up, then it's the way to go. You just carry one pole and one canoe and you've got the tarp, and a whole group can get under it.
Yeah, and even the sides, you could get paddle pockets. You could put 2 paddles together to create like about an 8-foot wall on the side, right? So the tarp doesn't go to the ground exact. You know, typically if you had one pole and a tarp, that the ends will be 4 feet off the ground. You can actually prop them up with 2 paddle pockets together, so you get like you know, I don't know, 6 feet, 7 feet off the ground. So you can walk under the tarp, no problem. And there's lots of room if you got whatever you got a 16 by 16, Fred, or a 20 by 20.
It's quite a tree trip.
Say again.
What I'm asking, Luigi, what adjustments do you make between a river trip and a backcountry trip?
That's a good question. And depending on, well, it'll depend on the type of people I'm going with too. I mean, typically with the river tripping is you don't have to worry about too much about the portages unless you're really worried about not running a certain section of river, right? So, I mean, you can bring a little bit more, let's say, comfort with you. Let's say, like you guys were saying, with the larger tarp and some poles and things of that nature. But I find that I do go a little bit heavier with river tripping as opposed to backcountry when you're doing a lot more portages, depending if those portages are actually clear or not. So, I mean, will bring an actual chair with me. I'll bring let's say a bigger tent. So I splurge in that regard of a little bit more comfort, just because of most of the time you're eliminating those portages.
Yeah.
And a little bit more food, because now you don't have to worry about hauling on your back, because now you have to worry about the portages.
Yeah.
My experience has always been, I've always taken a 70-liter pack and a 20, I think, for group trips. And always, I think, a suitable amount. So it's always been light, but somebody else has always done the food. One of the leaders just got this pallet that's quite plain, and he can't take any spice. So he's always controlled the food. So this week's been the first time I've ever prepared for a group trip, or just my daughter and I are going paddling. And I kind of feel like that rookie mistake comic that you had in the beginning, because I find some of my equipment is quite large. But when I was at Mech and other spots, I thought, oh, I don't know if I want to splurge $280 on the. I'll show you my canoe while you're here. I can bring. So
Yeah.
it's pretty full.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a 15-footer, so it's not that big. But I just don't know where I'm sort of getting too much stuff. Like it's a 4-person tent, which is kind of nice. I'm a big guy, and my daughter, and we want space. But yeah, I just find that some of that you still have to make quite an investment.
Yeah. But you make a good point though, Chris, is that once you start getting tabletop scale, you actually will start to realize, oh my God, that little axe actually weighs almost 700 grams, or that little chair that I was bringing weighs almost 500 grams. Again, grams make up kilograms, right? And then you start realizing that, hey, do I really need that? And that's when you start separating your needs from your wants. And this is where you can start reducing some of that weight. Again, if you're a bigger guy and you needed more space, you're not going to cram yourself into a solo tent if you're planning on going soloing, right? So this is where you got to make that decision. But I find that every time a piece of gear wears out, I use that now as an opportunity to, do I want to go over to ultralight and spend the money, or do I want to stick to what I have? I mean, I think of it as, yes, it's expensive, but if you spread out that cost over, let's say 10 years of enjoying that gear, I mean, to me, it's worth it. I mean, my tripping and my canoe tripping, that's my vacation per year. So I don't see it as, oh my God, I got to spend $500 on a tent. You spread that over 10 years, it's not that much money when you really think about it. So as long as you adjust your mindset, I mean, it's when that piece of gear works well and it's flawless, you'd be like, that's a great tent. You're not going to, it's the first thing that's not going to come out of your mouth to say that was a cheap tent. It's always the quality that comes out first, right? So as long as you shift your mindset a little bit, you'll be okay. But the key thing is get below the tabletop scale. You'll be like, oh my God, how much does that weigh? Yeah, it will freak you out.
Yeah, we don't have any portages, maybe 1 or 2, so it's not too bad.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking, and when I'm going on my own, I'm okay. Like, it's quite a bit lighter. But when you have somebody extra to throw into the mix, well, then you're thinking about all these other things, and you're sort of thinking about their comfort and food and whatnot. And
Yeah. And this is why dehydrating goes hand in hand. So you start dehydrating some meals, you'll save a lot on weight. I mean, it will pay for itself after several years of dehydrating your own food, especially if you like jerky. You'll save a ton of money on making your own jerky, and it'll taste better. Now, it's unfortunate we can't get together because of COVID this year, because I actually tried to have samples of jerky that I make for my friends at the actual Mech place, but we can't do that this year, but maybe next year. But once you start making your own jerky, you'd be like, you're never going to go back to actually buying store-bought dehydrated meals.
Yeah, I'll bring the beef.
Yeah, well, the thing that always struck me is it's like real food. So it's like it tastes like sawdust. It's like chili or real spaghetti or whatever you're making. I mean, I have some friends, once you start going with the same people after a while, like I always make chili and spaghetti sauce. Another guy makes, that he's always got that standard meal, so you can expect it,
Yeah.
And, you're like waiting for that, I don't know, that Chinese version of whatever he's making. it's good, you know. And then every
It's real food. Yeah.
people, and these new people bring in a new idea, right, of lentils or whatever it is. So there's all kind of neat stuff. It's like real food. So
Yeah.
that's the benefit. And you know, basically you could take a big can of spaghetti sauce and it's the size of your fist. It's like weighs nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, did you ever study how much, like if you took a kilogram of sauce, how much does it get down? It's like maybe 200 grams, I think, right?
Yeah. 300 grams at best, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
300 grams. Yeah, it's something like it's
Yeah.
a big number.
Yeah.
So
It's a lot of water you
basically,
get rid of.
if you lost 700 grams or 700 milliliters, you just add 700 milliliters.
Yeah.
And the only thing I would do different, or I do different, is I don't carry that container around, because when I get to camp, that's when I start rehydrating, and I just boil the stuff, you know, for a half an hour, and it just rehydrates.
Yeah.
Take long. And on a fire, half an hour fire, it doesn't matter, you know, it's just kind of there. It's not like
Right.
you're stove for a half an hour.
Yeah.
So that kind of works.
Absolutely. Any other questions, people?
Oh, there was a question of material for the fire tarp. I don't know if that got answered.
Well, it's made by Chlorophylle. The name of the company is Chlorophylle.
Yeah.
And they stopped making them for a couple of years because they couldn't get the fabric. And then I think everybody was whining about not being able to get these tarps because they're sort of the number one expedition tarp that all the outfitters use.
Yeah.
And so they resourced it, and now they have been making it. But it's a company in Quebec that was making camping equipment. And then they found there was more money in making clothes, so they stopped making the camping equipment.
Yeah.
But the only thing that they still were making was the tarp. And it's called the Caverne, and it's a 5x5. There's no choice of colors. It's white, and it used to be white and orange, and now it's white and lime green. But we've
Can you
had them
type
10
that in
years
the-
and under fire
the
and
chat?
smoke. You'll want to keep it in the garage or someplace because they'll smell smoky, but there's either no holes in it or very few holes in it. There could be.
Fred, can you type it into the chat for us, for the people that are asking? That way we have it documented somewhere of what's it called, if you don't mind.
Yes.
Perfect, thank
I
you.
can do that.
Yeah.
And it's
Or a
expensive.
link. If you
It's-
could put a link
Yeah.
in there, it'd be good
It's
too.
$329 or something. And so
Yeah.
they're not cheap.
Yeah, it's a
But
pretty
they
heavy
last a
tarp,
lifetime,
is what I
And
remember.
it does a group of 8 people, 10 people can get under it. So.
Yeah.
But like
Yeah.
per person, it's cheap and light.
Yeah, but it is a pretty heavy tarp. But it is bulletproof. I would say if you're doing a northern trip where there's zero portaging, yeah, it's
Like Tundra Rivers.
Yeah.
And Black Feather, that's the only tarp you'll see them with.
yeah. Now I think Fred and we did a trip somewhere in the Donald Lake area, and we had it. I think I can't remember exactly, but somewhere up there, and
Hamaguchi.
moderate portaging, so it was good. And I think we did a Kippawa trip.
Yeah, we had it on the Kippawa trip and the
Just on one
Hamaguchi.
day. We ended up camping one day. Well, we were kind of bushwhacking for this portage, and it was lightning, so we couldn't make it all the way. So we ended up just stopping on the trail, which wasn't really a trail, right, Fred? And we set up your tarp thing, and we ended up
Yeah,
building
but there was no trail.
under the tarp and putting them out in the rain. But it's an excellent tarp.
Yeah, all the corners of grommets in high winds, the grommets they've never come out, and they're over 10 years old.
Yeah. Well, like I said, and I brought it up, is all the gear, it's all got its pros and cons with weight and what it can do. So you gotta fit the gear to your trip and what you want to do.
Well, people, if there are no questions, I'm gonna stick around for a little bit if there are questions, but if there are no questions, have yourself a good evening, stay safe out there, and we'll see everyone on the trails. Bye now.